Welcome to the Low Carb MD podcast. No one is beyond help. No one is beyond hope.
As we have always said, we are bringing you medical information and cutting-edge science, but none of this is medical advice. Please seek out input from your own doctor.
Hey everyone, welcome to the Low Carb MD podcast. This is fun. This is a big one. As a matter of fact, I didn't know Jonny until I watched Fat Fiction. I was like, oh my gosh, who is this guy? He is awesome. Like, we were laughing like every time he came on. He's like, he has that same Jason Fung sense of humor. It's like, seriously, you guys thought this? So Jonny, it's an honor to have you on. It's so great. So great.
Can I just say the same thing back to you, because I didn't really know you before we did Fat Fiction, and then we sort of met on all these panels, and I'm so delighted to have met you, and such an admirer of your work now that I know about it, and I'm glad we're connecting like this.
Yeah, it's really important. I think it's important because I'll tell you, of all the areas of low carb, this is what scares everyone. This guy Tro Kalayjian knows a couple things too, I guess. So we let him.
Yeah, but, I'm the token weight loss guy here. That's Brian's the brains behind the operation.
Guy. Well, I started as a trainer and a weight loss coach. In fact, I was the first. The term weight loss coach was first applied to me in New York City. It was the first time anybody had used it, and it was by the editor of Cosmopolitan magazine. And she said, "You're not really just a trainer; you're a coach, because I do all these other things." And that was my field, just personal training at Equinox. And all I did was weight loss. And I came to this through that experience, because at the time, it was 1990 when I got into personal training. And we were all true believers when it came to low fat. I mean, we were, mea culpa on this, but we believed that if our clients didn't lose weight on the low-fat, cockamamie low-fat diet that we were giving them, and telling them to get on the Stairmasters and burn this number of calories, and if they didn't lose weight on that, we assumed they were cheating. Peter Attia, who we all know, great MD, did a beautiful TED lecture in which he was almost teary, apologizing to all the patients that he harmed over the years inadvertently, because he believed that myth. So I was a low-fat guy, and like all the trainers, and we would have clients coming to us who weren't losing weight on low-fat. Big surprise. Now, I'm not saying, I don't want to be hyperbolic and saying the low-fat diet never helped anyone. Obviously, some people did well on it, but way fewer than you would think, and certainly not my clients. So I remember one day this guy, Al, came in, and nothing we had tried had worked. And the Atkins diet had just been released for its third edition. 1992 came out, the third edition, and it was getting a lot of press, and as it always did. And he came in and said, I have friends who have lost weight on this. I'm going to try the Atkins diet. And I and every other trainer who had the same experience said, you can't do that, man. Yes, you might lose a pound or two, but you're going to die. All that fat and cholesterol, you're going to get a heart attack. You can't do it. And they didn't listen. And then a funny thing happened. They didn't die. And in this particular case, this guy, his eyes start looking clearer. His waist starts shrinking a little bit. He tells me his blood pressure, which he checks all the time, is normalizing. Even goes to his doctor, and his lipids, his triglycerides have come down. And I am left. I have a degree in psychology. That was one of my careers before I went full-time into this. And psychologists have a wonderful term for this. It's called cognitive dissonance. And it is the presence of two completely contradictory ideas. It creates dissonance. It creates an upset in our brain. We have to resolve that. This can't both be a phone and not be a phone. It's either a phone or it isn't, right? You can't hold both. This is invisible and this is real. You can't hold both of those concepts. So here I am thinking, Atkins diet kills people. It gives you heart attacks. But here's this guy who not only didn't die and get a heart attack, but he's improving on it. One of these concepts has to be wrong. Either this guy is not real, or perhaps what we've been taught is not accurate. So I began looking into that. And this is kind of when I started getting a little more into nutrition. And I looked at it and I thought, you know, the entire dietary guidelines have been based on one premise. Don't eat animal foods, don't eat saturated fat, 7% of the diet, and certainly don't eat eggs because they have cholesterol. Well, if that idea was wrong, what happens to the dietary guidelines that we've jammed down people's throats since 1986, telling them to eat these fakakta, low-fat, processed foods and reduce natural healthy fats? What happens to those guidelines? They are based on a wrong premise. And I started thinking about that. Now, I'm only a personal trainer. Yes, I had a degree in psychology, so thank God I could read studies. I understood research design. I understood statistics. But basically, I had no credentials. And I'm now questioning this stuff. And what was a very interesting thing, I know you'll relate to this, is when I had only credentials as a personal trainer, and I was good. I had 6 certifications. I was at Equinox. I was the dean of the Equinox Fitness Training Institute. So I was good as a personal trainer. But the only thing personal trainers learned at that time was nutrition information that was given to them by the American Dietetic Association, which I have gone on record as saying one of the most destructive organizations in terms of American health that we've ever seen. So we learned that you don't need supplements because you can get everything you need in food, and the fat was bad. And that's what we learned. So when I was teaching this stuff to trainers and teaching low fat and calorie counting, all the rest, nobody questioned my credentials. Now I'm getting up in front of audience and saying, guys, I think that we perhaps were a little bit too quick on the saturated fat thing. And here's a study or two. All of a sudden they come out of the woodwork. Who's this guy? Why is he teaching this stuff? He's not even a nutritionist. He's a personal trainer. He knows nothing. He has no qualifications. And that just, so I went back to school and I got my PhD. First, I got certified nutritionist. It was a 1-year course. And then I eventually went back, got the PhD in nutrition, got board certified by the American College of Nutrition. And then I went back to those same people who said, what do you know? And I said, I'm still going to tell you your ideas were wrong, except now I got the letters after my name, so I'm going to be a little harder for you to dismiss. And that's how I got into it. I mean, I didn't know much about it except what I read in the papers. I believed also in the cholesterol myths and in the saturated fat myths and all the myths that go around it. And my come to Jesus moment came out of fitness, out of personal training, out of seeing that it just wasn't happening in our life experience.
I think that's a hard thing. We can't unsee what we've seen, right? That's the hard part about when you say, gosh, they're like either everyone's lying to us and they're cheating all the time, or we're giving them bad information. Tro and I had to come to that same realization in our own lives and with our patients too. Now it's amazing how our patients don't lie to us anymore when they're low carb and keto and their processed food intake and watching their stress level. And that's what I loved about your book, just looking at it, was you're not just talking about diet, you're talking about lifestyle, you're talking about getting enough sleep and not being stressed. You're addressing all these areas that have been so lacking because they say it's the Mediterranean diet. It's like, well, it's the Mediterranean lifestyle, right? When you
man, I am so glad you brought that up, because I 100% believe that. I even believed it before I really understood how many holes there were in the cholesterol theory. I mean, we talk about Mediterranean lifestyle, about Mediterranean diet. My old nutrition mentor, the great late Robert Crahan, used to say Americans are so literal and they don't understand nuance. You tell them about the high fat Mediterranean diet and how well people do on it, and they think, oh, that means I should just add olive oil to my cornflakes. No, that's not what we mean at all. So it isn't about the addition of more fat to an already extremely bad high sugar diet. It's, excuse me, I just dropped a headset. Let me get the headset.
Poor Johnny. I mean, you can see he has low energy, Tro.
Yeah, I saw that.
We could just observe how weak and fatigued you are all the time. Yeah, you need to boost up your energy, Johnny. Knocking his headphones off, everything's going crazy up in here.
Well, I'm a New York Jew and I talk with my hands. I was interviewed by Vinny Tortorich the other day, great personal trainer, has Fitness Confidential podcast, and he's Italian. He says, this guy, meaning me, is the Jewish version of me, because he's a New Yorker Italian. I do talk with my hands, and so I'll try to knock it.
No, we love it, man. I love your energy. That's what I loved in Fat Fiction, that you're so passionate about what you're talking about. And you went back and got the training, and it had to be hard going back to your training and having to put down the answers are wrong to get the grade. And then you go and in real life, you kind of look and go, okay, all that stuff I did, now we have to figure the same thing we did in med school, right? You look and you go,
Well,
we're taught the wrong.
I don't have kids, but for those who have kids and are in our field, can you imagine looking at their nutrition homework from high school? I mean, they're still being taught this. They are still being taught this, and it still determines what kids eat in cafeterias, what colleges serve. I mean, the guidelines you and I might know, and your patients might know, and the people who listen to me might know, to not listen to the food pyramid and the My Plate, whatever version they come up with that continues to promote vegetable oil and high processed carb foods. We might know that. But those guidelines are taken very seriously. That determines what people eat in prisons, what people eat in hospitals, what the government serves in military bases. They determine nutrition policy. So in our bubble, we might say, God, this stuff's so out of date. Nobody's doing it. It's wrong. But most people don't know that yet. So we have a long road ahead if we're going to educate masses of people about the incorrectness of some of the dietary principles we've lived by.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. I think, and the interesting thing here was you were so passionate, you felt so strongly. It's like you went back and got additional training. I mean, I can relate to that so much. After I, lost all my weight, I said, I have to go get certified, board certified in obesity medicine. I can't, I have to change this, and that's amazing. People don't realize you go through hardship, a lot of hardship to do. People criticize us all the time, oh, you got books or you got a podcast or this or that, you're making money off of, selling a diet. But it's no, like we actually went through hardship to sell a diet. And I'm with you, not one diet works for everybody, but certainly low fat doesn't work for everybody. That we can say.
Yeah, that we can say with pretty fair certainty. So that's how I came to be studying cholesterol. And the way that this book got written in the original form back in 2010 was I had written a best-selling book called The 150 Healthiest Foods on Earth. And you guys know in publishing and in movies, all they like is sequels. So they have a hit, Die Hard 6. So we had the 150 healthiest foods, and it spawned a series, the 150 best ways to boost your energy, 150 best recipes for there's a whole 150 series, energy, anti-aging. So the publisher comes to me and says, we've got the greatest idea for the next book. How about the 150 healthiest foods that lower your cholesterol? And I said, well, guys, great idea for a book, not for me. And they said, well, why not? Isn't that a great idea? Everybody wants to do that. And I said, I don't believe it's the right target. I think it's a mistake. I think every time we give people advice about how to lower their cholesterol, we're buying into a myth that's going to explode in the next decade or two. And I think it's bad info, and I don't want to continue to perpetuate it. And they said, what are you talking about? Every doctor in the world thinks that this is what the truth is. And I said, well, as I said on Dr. Oz, I said at one point, the greatest scientist in the earth thought that the earth was flat. I'm sorry, it just turned out to not be so. So I finally convinced them that there would be a better book than How to Lower Your Cholesterol. But they were very hesitant. They said, well, we're not publishing a book by some cockamamie nutritionist who got, training, a kind of a pastiche of training and stuff. We need a doctor. We need an MD. And not only that, we need a cardiologist. And not only that, he's got to be world renowned, or he has to be well known. He has to be, So I call up Steve Sinatra. I said, you want to do this book with me? He says, yes. And that's how we wrote the original version of The Great Cholesterol Myth in 2010, which got us attacked viciously by just about everybody you can imagine in the medical profession. But 10 years later, people aren't laughing quite as much. And I see that as an encouraging sign. After we wrote that book, we did conferences like the A4M conference, and doctors would come up to us and they'd say, thank you for opening our eyes, or thank you for telling something that we have seen in our practice and know is true. Thank you for, finally putting it down in words. And 10 years later, when we redid it, we had a lot more research to back up what we were talking about. You know, you had that 2010 huge Ron Krause and Patty Siri-Turano study in the American Journal of Clinical Nutrition, where they looked at like 347,000 people, and they looked at saturated fat and endpoints, not the markers, not cholesterol. We don't care about cholesterol. We care about whether you die of a heart attack. That's what we really care about. Nobody cares about the lab measurement unless it's a good predictor of an end result we care about. So they looked at saturated fat and the endpoint. Do people who eat more saturated fat actually have more cardiovascular disease? And the answer was a resounding no, it just doesn't. And since then, how many studies have come out to confirm the same thing? I can't even, I mean, off the top of my head, 2014 Annals of Internal Medicine, British Medical Journal, Zoe Harcum's PhD thesis on the science that supports low-fat diets, which is basically zero. So there's a lot more evidence supporting the position we took in 2010. But I think the main difference between the old version and the new version, and the reason I am so passionate about getting this message out, is that, to be truthful, when we wrote the book in 2010, we knew cholesterol as we know and measure it. And let me be clear about that. I am talking about LDL cholesterol. I hope we get into why that is a ridiculous measurement to look at this point. But we're talking about that. We knew that was not the measurement to be looking at. But we weren't 100% sure what we should be looking at. And now we are. And that's why I want everybody to read this book. Of course, I want to sell books, but I'd give it away for free if I could. Here's the information that we found. And this is what I think is so revolutionary about this book. And we didn't find this information. We uncovered it. It's been sitting there in plain sight since 1970, but nobody's connecting the dots except people like Ivor and people who go on YouTube and present these wonderful lectures with all this data. But unfortunately, that has not penetrated the outer world. So here's what we found. There is a risk factor that shows up that has a direct line to heart disease, and it shows up a decade before any of this crap your doctor looks at. Before your doctor says, oh, Mrs. Jones, your cholesterol is rising a little bit. I think we better do something about that. Or before your doctor says, your diabetes doctor says, uh-oh, A1C is going up there. We got to get you on some metformin. A decade before that happens, something else begins to happen. And it can be studied, and it can be detected, and it can be tested. And here's the thing. It can be reversed, treated, or prevented. And that risk factor, hiding in plain sight, is none other than insulin resistance. It was shown in the 70s. This guy, Kraft, this doctor, invented an incredible insulin assay. An assay is a lab test. It's a verification of a metric. It was complicated. It was involved. Patients had to stay in his office for 4 hours. They would hook them up to 2 different tubes. One would feed glucose, one would feed insulin. But he developed a test for insulin resistance that is still state of the art, okay? Then he tests 4,000 people. And he puts them into quintiles, categories. So about 20% were insulin sensitive. And I'm assuming your audience has heard people talk about insulin sensitivity for the last, I don't know how long. So let's just go over that. We can go over what it is if you want to, but 20% of them, their carbohydrate mechanism worked great. They ate, they got some sugar in their bloodstream, insulin comes in, clears it out, everything's working great. Very small percentage of the population like that, but in his case, it was 20%. And then the next 20% were a little more insulin resistance all the way up to the last group, which was the most. Follows him for 10 years. Wants to see what happens. The first 20%, the insulin sensitive, not one heart attack, not one cardiovascular incident. Then you see the graph start to go up. Second tier, well, it's a little higher. Heart attacks, deaths, strokes, all of it. 4th and 5th categories. If that were the only study that linked it, okay. But now you get 1980s, Gerald Reaven comes along, Stanford University, and he invents something called Syndrome X. It was a collection of 5 conditions, right? It was abdominal obesity, low HDL, high triglycerides. And if you have 3 out of these 5 conditions, you have what's called metabolic syndrome X, which then quickly became called metabolic syndrome and is now also called pre-diabetes. And the even more enlightened way to label it is insulin resistance syndrome, but it's all the same thing. And he tested this and saw the same thing that Kelly had seen a tremendous relationship to diabetes, a tremendous relationship to heart disease. And then at the end of his career, he said, I wonder if it's related to anything else. Let's test the other diseases. And he looks at his data, and sure enough, insulin resistance tracked with all kinds of things, from cancer to lung to kidney disease to liver disease. So we have this thing, this metabolic problem with carbohydrates called insulin resistance. And it tracks really well with all the cardiometabolic diseases. In fact, in our book, we say diabetes is essentially pre-heart disease. Yeah, would you agree? It's like 80% of diabetics die of heart disease. So we are really looking at a kind of straight trajectory from the earliest signs, insulin resistance, to metabolic syndrome, pre-diabetes, to diabetes, which I think is pre-heart disease, to heart disease. It's a straight line. Now, we don't say in the book that insulin resistance accounts for every single case of heart disease. That would be crazy. There are obviously other cases that have nothing to do with it. But it tracks with heart disease as well as cigarettes track with lung cancer. And cigarettes, it's not 100% correlation. There are cigarette smokers who don't have lung cancer, and there are people with lung cancer who've never looked at a cigarette. But it tracks damn well. And so does insulin resistance. And the beauty of this is that it can be treated, as you guys know and live this every day. Insulin resistance can be reversed, treated, and prevented with nothing else but diet in like 98% of the cases. And that's the tragedy.
Yeah, that's the tragedy of what we're up against, because our guidelines say any diabetic you have has to have a statin drug. Why? Because they're increased risk of cardiovascular disease. But then you say, why? Why are the diabetics predisposed more than someone who's not diabetic with a LDL twice as high? And no one ever answers that question. I think what we're seeing was Dr. Kraft's data from what you're talking about. And I think because it's a standard of care and people go, okay, we just do that. And instead of saying, let's focus on the diabetes or the high insulin levels, it's all about LDL. So if I drop someone's A1C, which we just did this week, a great lady, 72 years old, dropped from 7.7 to 5.9 in 3 months, right? So
Wow.
now going down the run, and she's a miracle. But it happens all the time. Troy and I see it all the time. But then the question becomes, once diabetic, always diabetic or not, right? And we've never had this question ever before, because once you were diabetic, you were always diabetic, right? It was just considered that. So, you know, and that's why I loved about your book, looking at, and I think another thing I just want to step back to, because I'm thinking about you back in the day in the 80s and 90s. Ben Bakikio, who's a good friend of mine, he's a exercise guy. I don't know if you know Ben. Back then, they were saying, like the experts were all saying, you're crazy doing weight-bearing exercise with females. You're going to cause hormonal problems. You're going to kill these women. That's what they thought. They said, you're going to use up all their heartbeats and they're going to die young. And you must have heard that kind of stuff before. And I saw some of the articles he wrote back then in the 80s saying, I think this is safe. And here's the data. And here's all. And he's showing better metabolic health, that people live longer. The more muscle mass you have, the longer you live. We all see that, right? So because that has, it all ties back to insulin sensitivity again.
Yeah, I think that's the biggie. And as I often say, so if you look at the whole insulin carbohydrate metabolism kind of circuit, what triggers insulin release? When your blood sugar goes up, and especially when it goes up frequently and stays up there a long time. Okay, what foods raise, what macronutrients raise sugar, which will then in turn raise insulin? Well, we know carbohydrates are top of the list. They're going to raise it the most. Protein raises it somewhat. There are some gluconeogenic amino acids. It can do an effect on blood sugar. You know what doesn't budge the needle on blood sugar or insulin? Fat. So now think of the logic of assigning a low-fat diet to people who have a sugar problem. And all of this sugar, which is, of course, no fat, is raising their blood sugar, raising their insulin, and causing the very thing that they're trying to prevent. So it's a kind of Alice in Wonderland, you know, up is down, down is up. And you're right, it's the standard of care. And I'm going to give you an example of like the worst kind of doctors that I fight with. You want to know where this passion comes from? It comes from being bullied by doctors like this. And I'll tell you a perfect example, because I don't like bullying. I haven't liked it since I was 5 years old, and I don't like it whether it's medical bullying or whether it's, you know, schoolyard bullying. So I have a friend in her 60s who is the epitome of what we would consider healthy aging. She's in her late 60s. She hasn't got an ounce of body fat. She works out at Equinox 5 times a week, and she has a joyous life, a wonderful family, no risk factors. There's no abdominal obesity. There's blood pressure is low, nothing. But she's been walking around with like a 300 cholesterol reading, right? And, 160 LDL, whatever it is, for quite a long time. And she has one of these regular conservative, by the book, doesn't think, doesn't read doctors. And he wants her on a statin. I'm her best friend. I say, I want to see the numbers. And I've been saying, would you please get a modern cholesterol test before we even have this discussion? Because LDL and HDL, as I hope we'll discuss, are obsolete. That is message number 1 of the book. Never take a prescription based on the HDL and LDL test. So here's a doctor trying to give her a prescription for statin. It's a standard of care. And I'm telling her, please don't. I'm looking at her triglyceride to HDL ratio. It's inverted. She's under 1.0. I said, if I had that number, I don't care what my cholesterol is. Are you kidding? This predicts everything much better. So the argument continues with this doctor because she's on insurance and this is the doctor. And I keep telling her, please, would you go to somebody else? I got people in every state. Finally, he says to her, because I just hocked her so much about this. He says, okay, we'll compromise. Get a calcium scan. Now, calcium scan, I know a lot of your listeners know, is a picture to see how much plaque there is. It's not a prediction. It's let's look under the hood and see what's there, right? She gets a calcium scan. Brian, you want to guess what her number is?
0.
Exactly. Her number is 0. Folks, I would die for a calcium scan of 0. It means it is not even the beginnings of detectable plaque. She goes back to the doctor. What do you think he says? He says, you know what? I want you on a statin anyway. That's what we're dealing with, man.
Well, it's because as doctors, and I know Trojan deep thought over there, I could see him thinking, but as doctors are saying, look, it's perception. It's really about perception. Because if someone has an LDL of 160 and they do have a heart attack, then they're gonna say, doctor's not practice standard of care and come back. And
yeah, we got to change the standard of care.
Yeah, and they don't look at the studies. They don't look at the total cholesterol, HDL ratio, triglycerides, insulin levels, metabolic disease, and all these markers we're looking at. Because the other one who came on the scene that made me start thinking different. There's a bunch of people, but one was Dave Feldman. If you fast for 3 days, your LDL doubles. So it's not what you're eating that's messing up the LDL. And if the LDL is a problem, then we should all have heart attacks when we're fasting. So you start looking at real life and real data and you go, okay, how much of a difference? The Minnesota Heart Study, right? You go on vegetable oil and your LDL comes down, but you have more heart attacks. Like, I don't care what my LDL is, I'm not having a heart attack. So I think that's the big concern. But a lot of us say, I'm going to be sitting there and the judge and jury and everyone's going to look at you like, really? Like, everyone knows, doctor, if you skip breakfast, your metabolic rate drops to 0. Even we have 0 data, everyone believes that. I have patients tell me that all the time. If I don't eat, I'm going to go into starvation mode. You're 350 pounds. I don't think you're going into starvation mode.
We used to say that as trainers. Oh, you'll be in starvation mode. We know what you're talking about. We also told them to eat every 2 hours and to graze and eat mini meals. And why did we do that? Because we all had sugar-burning metabolisms. If you've got a sugar-burning metabolism and you can't access fat as a source of energy, you better eat every 2 hours or you're going to be climbing the walls. And that's exactly what we all did, because our bodies, think of our bodies. It's like, here's a fuel source coming down. It's not a good one, but we know what to do with it and it's immediate. And now you're going to deprive us of that. We're not ready. We don't even know the pathways to fat. It's like our fat stores are like a big bank account that we don't have the ATM code to.
That's a huge issue. That's a huge issue.
It's a huge issue. So of course we're feeding them every 2 hours. It was ridiculous. Keto people don't get hungry every 2 hours, or people who are keto friendly, or people who are eating a natural food diet. They're missing breakfast. I haven't eaten breakfast. I'm about to play 2 hours of tennis. I'm not exactly going, where's my food? Where's my food? So it's very kind of tied into that. And if you look at fat as the ultimate source of energy, you want a metabolism that knows how to access it. You want a flexible metabolism that isn't just relying on the sugar hit that from your power bar that you just ate, and is actually being able to access the fat stores. And that's the beauty of a higher fat diet with less processed carbohydrates.
Tro, what do you want to throw in here, man? I see you thinking.
No, I like
I can feel him thinking.
No, it's a shame. It's a shame because our The problem is doctors aren't paid to think anymore. They're paid to, by insurance companies to uphold guidelines without thinking about the person in front of them. And if that doctor, just merely looked at the data, like, let me go look. In fact, I mean, I have it right here on my desktop. Like, this is how often I have this conversation. I literally have it on my desktop, and I'm going to share my screen right now. Like, it's right here. Okay. This is what happens when your calcium score is 0. It doesn't matter whether you take a statin or not. It does not appear that there's a significant difference in cumulative events, strokes, and heart attacks. Now, if you have a crazy calcium score, maybe that statin and aspirin have an effect, right? And that's a different discussion. But a low or 0 calcium score, this is the power of 0 study. It looks like there's almost nothing. I mean, this is how often I do this. It's sitting here right on my desktop. I didn't know what you're going to talk about. It's just sitting here right on my desktop because that's how often I do this. So it's not that statins are these evil drugs. Certainly that there's some controversy there. It's not exactly that they're benign drugs either. They can cause liver injury. They can cause muscle injury. So the bottom line is our doctors, they're paid to regurgitate guidelines as quickly as possible. And our patients are not exactly they don't always fit the bill. Here you have somebody with a mildly elevated cholesterol who has a 0 calcium score, right? And who's otherwise metabolically healthy. We have to ask, okay, what is the risk benefit in primary prevention of putting you on a drug? What is the downside? Well, what is the risk and what is the benefit? And, and we've seen it. I mean, here again, I have it right here. I didn't know what you were going to talk about, but I have it right here because I do this, every day. Okay.
And I think that's true. Yeah. And I think that's where we lose. We have to look at the risk and benefit of everything we do. So we say, let's lock down everyone to prevent COVID. And you see suicide rate going up. You see dementia getting worse. You see people dying of other causes. And you go, oh, let's look at this again, guys. Because once we make up our mind, we're looking at if we just look at heart disease and we forget about cancer, infection, all these other problems that can rise, right? Quality of life, the ability to exercise.
Right? How often have we seen this? Primary and secondary prevention, right? If you're primary prevention, really lowering that cholesterol has much less of an impact, than if you have a high calcium score or you have disease, right? So honestly, what you're describing with your friend here, Dr. Bowden, it makes me sad. It makes me sad for my profession. It makes me sad that somebody like you who knew the truth had to go out and get more, certifications, more letters behind his name to go publish a book, when the truth has been there for years. So it just makes me sad.
Well, and the other thing you did in your book that I really liked is you went through all the studies, because a lot of times the headlines don't meet, as we know from the media, the headlines don't match what the story says, right? You look and you go, wait, that's not what they were talking about. That's not what it seemed like. But there's a lot of stuff like that when you actually look at the studies and the data where you say, there's some that we looked at for diabetes management, the Accord trial, for instance. You start looking and say, well, how do they manage the sugars? By drugs, not by lifestyle. So they say, well, you don't want to have too low A1C and insulin levels in diabetics. Really? Why not? Right? So there's a lot of stuff like that. When you look at the actual outcomes and what happened, most of us don't have time. Doctors are working 14-hour days. They're not going to go and read these studies. You had time to do this apparently. But, I think it's important that we just believe stuff because that's what we were told. That's what one big, huge thing Tro and I talk about. Is everything we learned in, not everything, but a lot of things we learned in residency and med school is people just told us that's how it was. And you go, okay, I'll just keep doing that then. Right. And then you kind of have, the big conspiracy theories looking at where the information came from. And I think you talked about that, some of the data, how we haven't seen the actual raw data on some of these trials. And that's not, I want to see the data to make my decision and see how you collected the data, who you excluded, who you kept in the study.
They won't give us that data.
They won't give us the data. Give us the data and let us look at it. Why? It's the same thing. It's this argument about the votes. Let the two sides look at it. If it's a fair vote, cool. That's what it is, right? So I think it's one of those things I always tell Tro, trust but verify. Right. Let me just look at this. See, and if it's true, it's true. Cool. I'll go with you, right?
You stimulated so many thoughts. I don't know exactly which one to go to, but let's talk. You mentioned COVID, and I'm on a book tour. Basically, I'm doing this stuff, and every television station, all anybody wants to talk about is COVID. Here's the relevance of what we're talking about to COVID, because it's so relevant. And this is another reason why I'm passionate about getting out there. This is not just about losing weight. It's not even just about preventing heart disease, which would be big enough if it were. Look at the comorbidities for COVID. Let's list them. High blood pressure, metabolic syndrome, or prediabetes, diabetes, heart disease. Starting to see a connection? Every single one of them, the cardiometabolic diseases, have insulin resistance at its core. And that is what we're talking about reversing with a lower carb diet. So people have asked me, are you afraid of COVID? I interviewed Daniel Amen the other day. He's in my age group. He's a little younger, but he's in my age group. I said, Daniel, and he's a friend of mine. And so before we started the interview, I said, Daniel, are you, you're in the same age group as I am. Are you hovering? Are you scared? And he says, well, it's a nasty virus. I certainly don't want to get it, right? But I think I'll be okay. My vitamin D level is 73. I think I'm going to be able to fight it if I get it. And this is the point. I'm not saying that, I'm not blaming the victim like we're all at fault because we didn't take care of ourselves. I'm saying that eating the diet we're eating is wrecking our immune system. And I'm not saying people wouldn't be dying of COVID if it weren't that. I do not think we would be seeing the same death rates and the same severity of reactions, as many severity, if we weren't metabolically broken across the board. And we show data in there, at least 52% of the world has some degree of metabolic syndrome, of some degree of insulin resistance. And Nina Teicholz told me the other day, it's 88% in this country. So we're talking about something that's very widespread, that is using the resources of the immune system, and it's using it on user-generated errors. It's using it on unforced errors of stress and bad diet and all the other stuff that depletes our immunity and causes insulin resistance to do even more damage. And then we got to go fight a virus. Well, yeah, it's like I have a fire department down the street from me, and I also have the Topanga Canyon wildfires about a mile from me. So there are wildfires out there. We want our fire department, we want those men and women to be fully rested. We want them to be fully nourished, and we want the engines to be working on their fire trucks, right? This would be like if a bunch of teenagers are setting off stupid little fires and pails and little, prank balls, and all the fire people are out putting out these dumb little things. And now you get a Topanga wildfire. Guess what? Half the people are gone from the fire house because they're taking care of this piddly stuff. That's what we're doing. That's the importance of this diet, because this diet is depleting the very system we need to fight off the virus. Do you agree?
Absolutely. It's interesting that you say that, but there's this really great book, and in the book it says you can't serve two masters. You can't serve two masters. And look at history. You can't win a war on two fronts. How many times has somebody won a war on two fronts? So yeah, if then this is the problem. You gave so many caveats to basically say, because this is how aggressively people have come after us for saying, you are what you eat. The food that you eat is going to affect your body. And if you give your body things that it is not prepared to deal with, in the quantities it's not prepared to deal with, you will reap what you sow. And these foods, these modern processed foods, we were not meant for these foods. No animal was meant for the amount of food that we have and the way that we've combined the food to make them awesome. It's just, it's insanity. And when people are scared of this virus, you know what? I think it's just showing us how vulnerable we are, how sick we are as a population.
Exactly. It's exactly.
88% are metabolically unwell. And it's our fault. It's mine, Brian.
Well,
you're
our soft underbelly. It's our soft underbelly, man, and it's our soft underbelly is our soft underbelly, right? That's why they call it that, right? Because that's the if it's not COVID, it's gonna be the next bug that comes along, and
exactly.
we all know that, and that's part of why what I see as our type of medicine. Every orthopedic surgeon should be calling us saying, guys, look, I've got people I can't do surgery on. Why? Because if you're obese and diabetic, your chance of infection, problems, comorbidities, dying on the table go way up. So give them to us for 6 weeks and let us send you back a patient who's healthy for surgery, and maybe even avoid that surgery if we can get that inflammation down enough. And I think those are the kind of things we have to start. We have to start thinking to save our healthcare system and our people, that, hey, metabolic health is critical. And I think it's not, like you said, like very astutely, and this is what I say too, it's not about the weight, it's about metabolic health, because there's people who are overweight that aren't metabolically sick. I think we really have to look at that. It's one of the big things with inflammation. The people who are dying of COVID, it's an inflammatory problem, the cytokine storm. It's the decreased immune system. You know, LDL cholesterol dropped significantly with COVID, by the way, because it's fighting off infection also. So there's a role from that standpoint. And so we have to look at all-cause mortality also and say, okay, you don't die of heart disease, but you died of, oh, thank God I died of something different, right? I mean, it's one of those things,
Exactly.
like, I want to live as long and healthy as I can. I want to be like you, right?
Are you saying I'm old, Brian?
No, I want to be like you and have your energy and focus. Tro and I are more chill and mellow, right? But you love what you do and you have a passion, right? And that, we lost Johnny.
See, you made fun of his.
I call him old and he leaves, man. Tro calls me old all the time, and he's a young dude.
I told you to
man.
be nicer to our guests. You know, you can make fun of me,
what
Brian,
happened?
but you can't. You know, you can't.
We lost our guest. Now it's just me and Tro again. But I think some huge, while we're waiting for him to log back in, I think there's some huge issues that he's raising. I think, you know, really, Tro, it's fear, right? Us docs are very fearful of standing out and saying, I know it scares you too. Oh, you back.
See, I told Brian not to, you know.
I said I make one joke and here it goes. Like, I'm out of here. I'm done with all these guys, right? But I have a great beard. Look at you. I want to be like you, man. When I'm saying I want to be like you, I'm saying, look, having energy, focus, passion. And I think the people I love in this world, this is why I loved you right from the start, right? Because when you say, I'm going to stand up against the garbage that's out there, I don't care if everyone is saying something different. I see truth and I see what's happening and I see the benefit of my patients. And I think that's, Tro and I started this podcast because we're both seeing it and we go, okay, what do? We just hide in our little shell. Because the other thing is, look, when you go against the establishment and you go against the paradigm, it is not, and Dr. Kraft was never accepted in his life about what he was talking about, even though he was right. So
neither was the inventor of homocysteine. How about telling that story sometime? Kilmer McCulley was taken out of Harvard. They put his lab, he invented homocysteine. He's noticing a connection between homocysteine and heart disease in children who, regardless of the cholesterol, and he's noticing these kids with heart disease and he sees a connection. He goes, you know, guys, maybe we ought to be looking at this. Well, long story short, he winds up being demoted at Harvard. They wind up putting his lab in the basement. They take away his postdocs and graduate assistants and basically strip him of every prestige and ability to do research. And he leaves Harvard. 25 years later, they welcome him back to the faculty. Homocysteine is on every blood test, and everybody recognizes that it's a serious inflammatory marker. This profession doesn't welcome new information. It's a very conservative. I love you, Brian, but your profession is very conservative.
Yeah, it's the problem is we kind of, anything that goes against what we already know it to be true. So you say something like, "Oh, you're a fringe person, right?
Yeah,
you're a conspiracy theorist." And
I've gotten that all my career.
Me, even with me, you know, like when I first heard about Jason Fung, I'm like, yeah, let me look at this guy. What's he selling, right?
Oh,
so I think
man,
things, and you start realizing, oh, it's working clinically. I think that's the point, because we've all experienced, every doctor listening has experienced when they say this is the best drug. Remember, Tro, you know, Alestra blocks fat. This is going to cure the world of all the problems, and everyone's going to be skinny now. And it was a total disaster. You had anal leakage all the time, and
oh my God,
it wasn't really fun for people. So it never caught on because that wasn't the problem, right? So so many times we come up with this, like you talked about Entenmann's cakes and those kind of things, saying, okay, there's going to cure the world of problems because it's low fat.
Yeah.
And it didn't work. It didn't work.
So then you have to reassess. It did not work. Yeah. You know, I want to make sure that people listening have some clear path about what to do. I don't, it's so easy for us because we are behind the scenes and we see this stuff and we're dealing with this establishment and there's the rigidity and inability to process this or look at new information. And we get frustrated and we can easily go into bitch sessions. And I'm thinking of the poor Mrs. Jones who's sitting there going, so what am I supposed to do? They can't even agree. So let's give them some let me try and to give some basic take homes about this. If your doctor gives you the LDL HDL test let me tell you what we found, what we talk about in the book. There are 13 different types of cholesterol that have been identified, and who knows if they're going to identify more. There's, if you look at it, LDL-A, LDL-B, there's small LDL, big LDL. More importantly, there's LDL 1, 2, 3A, 3B, 4A, 4B, there's HDL 2A, 2B. We are using the equivalent of a flip phone in the age of the Galaxy 8 and the iPhone 12 Mini Max. You can't use this tool, which was designed in 1963, when you know that, in fact, there's all this other stuff going on that we could be looking at. And there is a test for all of that stuff that looks at the number of particles. And I'd love to talk for a minute about what a particle is and why that is so important. So we have these tests, and to continue to prescribe very serious drugs with a long laundry list of potential side effects, to continue to prescribe drugs based on this, what's essentially an astrological prediction, high LDL, high H. We show studies in the book where they looked at cardiovascular admissions in hospitals in the United States. There are a couple of such studies. And hundreds of thousands of patients admitted for anything on the spectrum of cardiovascular disease, right? Coronary artery disease, all of it. And depending on the study you read, between 50 and 70% of them have normal LDL cholesterol. I mean, and you know what the establishment says? Oh, we should lower what the normal rate is. I mean, so here's the thing, LDL is a huge category. There's a million different ways LDL can show up, and there is a test for this. Now, when people go to their doctor and says, I want the NMR particle test, or I want the lipo profile panel, there's a million tests like this, they get a lot of resistance. Here's a take home. Ask your doctor to give you the ApoB test. It's a great surrogate, and they know what it is. Their brains go, oh yeah, that's on the guidelines. Great, get that one, because there's an ApoB particle, a protein that attaches to every one of the LDL. You want to know how many LDLs there are. And let me tell you why. People don't understand the difference between cholesterol and a lipoprotein. So cholesterol can't travel in the blood. It would be like putting oil in a river. It's going to just disperse. It can't get anywhere. It doesn't bind with water. It has to travel in a container. It has to travel in a container. The L in HDL and LDL stands for lipoprotein. The lipoprotein is the container. So think of it this way. Lipoproteins are the boats. Cholesterol are the cargo. We don't care about the cargo. We care about the boats. Why? Because the more boats in the water, the more likelihood somebody's going to bump into each other. There's going to be a crash. The more cars on the highway, more likely of a fender bender. The more people in a nightclub, even if they're nice, wonderful people, more likelihood somebody's going to bunch up against somebody else and there's going to be a fight. You want to know the number of particles, and we call particles all those LDLs. How many of them are in the water? That is useful information. That's the test we should be giving. You should never, ever take a prescription for a statin if it's only based on LDL. Get the particle test, and if they don't do the particle test, ask them for the simple old ApoB test. It's just as good.
And this is the problem. ApoB is cheap. It costs about $8.
Yeah.
It's a great surrogate for, it's what's believed to be causative in terms of atherosclerosis. But, even that takes some nuance. And the problem is I think, and this is the reality, okay? Mm-hmm. We've been focusing on lowering saturated fat for lowering LDL, but now we have pretty good data that lowering fructose lowers LDL.
Oh man!
So if you want to lower LDL, my start with fructose, start with the sugar, start with the processed carbohydrates, and then if you really care about where the LDL, ends up, you can evaluate it after you do that. The processed carbs, the sugar, and the fructose, those gotta go. So, but it's cardiologists decided not to focus on any of that. It's like
that
all
makes sense in the setting
of
a statin drug too, Tro, because when you go on a statin, they say, well, it causes diabetes. Well, really, if you don't change your diet and you go on a statin, because you're blocking those carbons that are transferring over to the LDL cholesterol. So yeah, there's so much of that, and I think we we lose sight, because we can predict. I mean, it's very rare, and I've seen it, but it's very rare that we put someone on a low carb or a ketogenic diet and their triglycerides don't drop significantly.
Like a rock, like a rock.
A couple times, but it catches your attention. Go, why in the heck is that? And usually we'll come back to alcohol at night or something different that's doing that. But yeah, there's a lot of stuff like that. And I think as we're going along, we're learning. And I think what we're really learning, what I'm learning, is not everyone's the same. Some people are going to lose weight really quickly. Some people are going to struggle more if they have more visceral fat, and there's different energy. But one thing that I would just like to raise, because I know we've talked about it, you raised this point of this of lipid, like fat not raising sugar levels or insulin levels. But what's interesting, I see some people, if they're really metabolically sick and I put them on a higher fat diet, their sugar spike like crazy. And I say, let's fast for one day. As a matter of fact, I'm going to look at a guy's labs this morning because we're doing an experiment with him. When he fasts, he dropped his sugars from 280 consistently down to 90 consistently for 2 weeks. And then he started going back up again. So I think sometimes when you get, I think like Ted Naiman and talking about this energy model or the personal fat threshold, very intriguing. And I think some people, depending where you are metabolically, some people, when they're really metabolically sick, you give them a bunch of protein, their sugar spike like crazy. When they're metabolically healthy, it doesn't. That's what I'm seeing, at least clinically.
Yeah.
So
well,
yeah,
I think
intriguing.
I think what you're underlying here is a great point to kind of maybe spend a couple minutes on, or even wrap up on, which is the unique individuality of every patient and every person listening to this. There is no, I learned this in my weight loss coaching days. I'm sure you guys learned it way before I did. No one size fits all. Anything works for anybody in any phase of life. Not on a dating site. We don't all want the same type, and not in a health program. We learned it with exercise. I remember there was a bodybuilder who won Mr. Olympia, and he did 100 rep sets. That's unheard of, but it worked for him. There are all kinds of variations. There are people, I have found this in practice of working with people for a decade. There's going to be someone who takes a Valium and goes right out and parties, and there's going to be someone who has 2 espressos and goes to sleep. Our metabolisms are very individual, which brings us to a point you raised much earlier, which is all the other things we're not talking about, such as diet, besides diet and exercise, that impact our health, our well-being, and our risk for heart disease. Our stress levels, our connection to our community, our connection and relationships to our family, to our church, to our atheist group, to our mosque. It doesn't matter. It's connection and contribution and well-being. Do we meditate? Do we have any time that we take for ourselves? Do we have a relationship with a pet that we pet every day and walk? These things make profound differences. And I would love people to take a little bit of a helicopter view and see that diet and exercise are 2 components, and God knows I've spent my career on them, and you guys have spent careers on them, and we think they're very important. Nobody's saying they're not, but so is if you love the person you're with, or if you love your grandmother, or if you have a dog that you like to play with. They count. If you get sunlight, there's a whole field of therapy, psychotherapy, called ecotherapy, because they found that exposure to greenery, just looking at the stuff like that, actually changes some of the metrics in blood tests. So I know you guys care about that.
Maybe if there was a podcast talking about that called Life's Best Medicine that I'm doing right now, right?
Life's Best Medicine.
Yeah, you're invited, man. I want to have you on there, talk about this stuff, because
Life's Best Medicine. I love it.
This is part of the life we miss. We don't talk about the spiritual aspects of what gives you peace. I am floored. That's why. That's part of the reason.
It's the whole story. It's like more important than the other stuff. I've seen people on crappy diets. I did a speaking course with Les Brown once, and this guy comes from England, and he's like the fittest and most. It's like, what do you do, dude? I've never seen, just perfect. And he was not a minister, but he was some. That's what he did. He went and did missionary work, and his life was spiritual stuff. And he comes in for breakfast the next day. He's eating Doritos, and I'm thinking, you know what? I mean, there's a lot of things that go into health. Certainly, our well-being, our souls. I'm not religious. I'm just, all of that stuff goes into it. And maybe when you're really good in one area, it compensates for some of the others. Who knows? So don't ignore those other things. I mean, this guy was doing great on Doritos. I don't know how long it would have continued like that, but I think that if you put, it's like you have a health bank, and every habit and every relationship and every food that you eat and every drug that you take and every nutritional supplement you take is a contribution to that bank account. It's either a withdrawal or it's a deposit. And none of them are so significant that they change your entire life, but they add up just like a savings account. So maybe every one of these things, having nourishing relationships, having some charity in your life, having some grace, having some generosity, having some loving kind of Buddhist type of meditation. I do it frequently, called the loving kindness. It's called metta. And just some of that stuff is putting deposits in your health account. And yeah, maybe your cholesterol is not so great, or your LDL, or this or this. And we want to work on that. But it's the overall account that you want to look at the balance. You don't want to look at just every one of these things under a microscope without realizing that the others make very important contributions. And that stuff people can take to the bank and start working on right now.
Yeah, and that's a huge thing, because I've seen it. I've had people on a good ketogenic diet that exercise, they're doing all the right stuff, and they're not losing weight. I'm like, how's things at home? And the tears come, and you realize, right? They're stressed, they're tense, they're angry at the world, they're worried, but the whole world's going to end in a week or two. So all those things, having the weight of the world on your shoulder and being tense, and that's that I had to look at that in my own life at 50 years of age. Like, what the heck am I doing? Killing myself, working 14 hours in the system. So thankfully, Tro helped me on that one. To help say, Brian, what the heck are you doing, man? You're killing yourself. But also, I think part of it is, when we look at it, people get really concerned. Like, say we get someone with a high coronary calcium score, right? For me, I'm thinking metabolic health. But what are some other things we could do? I know Dr. Perlmutter has contributed here, and I think we see those coronary calcium. We go, okay, what the heck do we do if it is elevated? We like the 0 scores, but if it's elevated and they had a lot of damage from poor lifestyle for a lot of years, now we're trying to change that lifestyle, right? I know we're talking about L-carnitine and some different supplements. I'll tell you, and you can go back and listen to the old podcast. I say, what's weird is, and Tro knows, I go, the darn carnivores. I see people go carnivore and their mood, stress level, all this stuff gets
crazy,
better. I go,
right?
I don't know why, but they do. And then you look at L-carnitine. There was just a study that came out that says, like, which is high in meat, that people that are taking L-carnitine do better from a mood standpoint. I was like, maybe they were missing that at some point in their life, and maybe that's it. Or, from a cardiovascular standpoint, you go, there's a lot we don't understand. And you go, okay, certain dietary changes. So I've never been a huge person on a ton of supplements, but I know you went through supplements in your book.
I'm pretty big on supplements. I take about 50 things a day.
Yeah, no,
and
I would love to hear what you think are the most valuable in people on a they're trying to really watch their diet, and you have a significant family history of heart disease, for instance.
I'm such a believer in individualized programs that I'm very, very hesitant to give any dietary prescription or even any supplement prescription. What I am comfortable saying, and have said many times, is that if you're an ordinary person and you're not a nut like me with a cabinet full of supplements, and you don't take 2 doses a day of like 18 on one day and 20, and you just want to know what are the 3 most important things to take. And if I could get people who are taking nothing to just take these 3, I would feel improved. And I can add a 4th or a 5th if they're willing to take an extra one. Fish oil, magnesium, and vitamin D. I think that almost universally, in my experience, 30 years doing this, there's almost no one who wouldn't benefit from a little more fish oil, certainly a little more vitamin D, and a little more magnesium. Every study I've seen shows, double-digit deficiencies of those 3 very, very important nutrients. And maybe I'd add a multiple in there if they're willing to take a 4th, just so that they can cover the little things like manganese and things that. But we talk in the book about particular heart healthy supplements. Steve is a huge fan of CoQ10, obviously, and now people are even on TV. I'm finally hearing ads saying, "Did you know, statins deplete, so you need coconut," whatever it is. So that's meeting into the mainstream a little bit. Funny that you mentioned carnitine, because the same nutrition mentor that I'm so indebted to, Robert Crayon, wrote a book called The Carnitine Miracle. He was a huge, and this is 20 years ago, 30 years ago, huge promoter of L-carnitine for so many reasons, because it transports fat into the mitochondria, all of that stuff. But I hadn't heard the mood connection. But these things that we got from our natural diet, and by natural diet I mean this: foods you could hunt, fish, gather, or pluck. So when people ask me, well, what's the best diet? There's so much contradictory information about diets. I feel for the consumer how confusing it must be when they hear all of this data and all. So I always say, again, let's take an elevator view. There's a lot of different points of view about what a good, healthy diet is. So the human genus, and by which I mean the progenitors of Homo sapiens, the genus Homo has been on Earth for about 2.4 million years. Homo sapiens, depending on what anthropology study you read, came out of Africa 110,000 years ago. McDonald's became a franchise in 1957. Processed food's about 100 years old. So if you are from another planet and you're looking at the Earthlings and you're going, what, getting all this dietary information, where should we look to for the wisdom of the ages? How about looking at the food that sustained the human genus for 2.4 million years, not what came out, in big food since 1900. And that is, no matter where people lived, no matter what they did, it was food they could hunt, gather off the ground, pluck off a tree, or fish for. And if it's in those categories, I think that's more important than whether you're on keto, whether you are a vegan, whether you're in any one of the dietary philosophies. If you're eating food you could have hunted, fished, gathered, or plucked, the rest is details. And that to me is the most important nutritional, soundbite to take away.
Yeah, that's a huge takeaway. And hey, Troy, why don't you look at the questions from our lovely Patreon people? Because I can't multitask.
Let's open it up, guys. We want to open it up, about 5 minutes worth of questions.
And I get the first. I get the first question for Johnny. Okay, I'm a doctor.
Ask a question.
I get someone who comes in, poorly controlled diabetes. They said, Doc, I'm not giving them donuts and cake. Now, luckily for me, I'm no longer in that paradigm because people are paying for my advice, and they said, look, help me get better, help me get off meds. I think, the standard doctor out there isn't in the same boat I am. So their situation is the person comes in not willing to change their lifestyle. Now I'm not going to exercise. I'm not going to watch my stress level. I'm going to do what I'm doing. I'm going to watch TV and sit on my butt all day. Is there an indication for a statin drug in those people?
Well, I'm not a medical doctor, and so I don't ever want to make blanket statements about that. I think that if someone is coming to the doctor for something, there's something they're not happy about. And if you tell them this is what would change that, and they don't want to do it, I think sometimes you have to let them do that. If you must take care of them, yes, you patch it up any way you can. You give them I'm glad you brought up statins, because we talked about statins a lot. In the first book, we called the chapter on statins the statin scam. I changed that title in this one because I didn't want to be so adversarial with mainstream medicine. I want to bring some of these doctors into our camp. I want some of them to hear it. And if you tell them it's a scam, you've lost them. That's like every argument, whether it's about politics or relationship. You give them, if you attack, you're done. We called the chapter in this the statin deception, because statins do have a place in treatment. Steve doesn't like them a lot, barely uses them, but there are some people, and maybe the one that you just mentioned is such a case, who do benefit. The deception is that they will benefit everybody, that they will benefit beyond the small population in which they've been shown to have an improvement, which you had pointed to earlier with the graph. In secondary prevention, here's a guy, he's already had heart attack, he's already got heart disease, he won't stop eating donuts. We want to prevent the second heart attack. Yeah, there's a mild benefit for statins. Why? Because they're anti-inflammatory, not because they lower cholesterol, by the way. That's the least important thing they do. They are mildly anti-inflammatory, and they thin the blood a little, which is, I can do very well with fish oil, thank you very much, and vitamin E and ginkgo, but without any side effects. But the point is, here's this guy, if he's not giving up donuts, he's not taking supplements. So yes, a statin drug might help with that. My issue with statin drugs is that the companies that make them did what every capitalist company in the world does and is supposed to do. They did a brand extension. They got, okay, we got a market here. How do we expand it? Let's come out with more colors. Let's market to this country or to this demographic. And they took this drug that was sort of mildly successful with middle-aged men with previous heart conditions. They said, what about the ones who don't have heart conditions? What about women? What about old people? Hey, let's give it to 13-year-olds. We can prevent that heart disease. It was the brand expansion and the attempt to get statins to be like they should be in the water supply. That's what we don't like, not the existence of them. We don't want people thinking we think that this is a horrible drug and that every doctor who gives it to you is evil. It's not that. It's like most people don't need them. And the list of side effects is this long. You and I would take any drug if the chance of not dying of cancer was very high by taking that drug. We take any side effects if it's going to save our life. But the damn thing doesn't do that. It doesn't save lives. We show it in the book. We graph it out. David Diamond has made these incredible graphs that show you, if you look at the data in objectively, there are no lives saved. You might save 2 heart attacks in the statin group, and then you lose 2 people for diabetes in the other group. It's not, as you said, it's not a success if you die of a different disease.
Yeah, it's interesting. The data I've reviewed, when you look at the WAS-COPS trial,
Yeah,
like there was a mild decrease in mortality and primary prevention, just so mild that it's almost like clinically insignificant. And I think you're right. I think the big problem here is the pharma stopped looking at who can we actually help: patients with high calcium scores, people with prior coronary disease, right? And they said, how many people can we sell to? Right?
yes,
And I think
that's the problem.
when that transition happened, that made it stop being a drug that we can really, they want us, right? It benefits them for the clear indicate, like it's better for them to have us say, we need to give it to everybody because it lowers the risks in everybody. It doesn't benefit them to figure out exactly who are the people that benefit. If you look at the trials that took patients with high CAC scores and gave them statins, they were privately funded. No pharma donated money to have that study done, right? Because they're not interested in lowering their market potential. So it's sad. I do think statins have a role, as you say. There's certain people that there's certainly a role, but it's not like we shouldn't be sitting there fighting with patients to take a statin. We should be sitting there fighting with patients on, you need to reclaim your life. You need to focus on diet, exercise, your life, your stress, your relationships.
Yeah,
that is what we need to focus on.
That's the key, and that's what we're focused on. We have time to do that, and I love that part of it, man. I mean, that is what I love, because you're reaching into someone's mind, motivation, and you're helping them, and you see them get better, and you think, wow, right? I had so many patients this week said, this is the first Halloween I didn't have candy and I didn't care. And I was like, wow, that's kind of crazy, right? So it's cool. Like, they should be proud of that, right? It's something where you're making positive changes. Excuse me. And I think that was the point I was raising. And I'm glad you answered that way, because as a doctor, if I have someone who's metabolically sick, their chance of dying of a heart attack is massively higher. I know that from high insulin level, insulin resistance, all that stuff. So I have no choice but to put them on a statin to protect my own butt. Right? Because if you're not going to do it, I said, look, I can keep putting you on more and more diabetes medicines, or we could reverse the process and put you in permanent remission. I won't call it a cure. I'll say permanent remission.
Oh, I love that. That's great.
I stole that from Gary Fettke. That goes to Gary Fettke. We just had on, but that's
Gary
true.
Fettke. Yeah.
He said, I won't be controversial. I'll say that I'm in permanent remission from a condition.
Yeah.
Yeah, good. If you're off, if you cure your breast cancer, you're in permanent remission, maybe, right? And so, but I think that's as long as you're taking the treatment for that disease process, right? That's what we've missed out on, and it's a lot faster and easier to throw a pill at someone rather than, because the average doctor who has 8 minutes with a patient cannot explain all this stuff, right?
No,
they're not going to recommend your book, right? So I'm hoping that just having that knowledge and looking at and I think for people, I think it's a huge step to go on a drug that you're gonna be on the rest of your life. Right. So I think it's a huge step. It's worth your time to investigate, read a book, look at Dave Feldman's work, look at what happens when you fast, and do it. I mean, and I think that's what I love. And for us, Tro and I have our best markers, a continuous glucose monitor, and people put those on and they realize, like in the movie, right? Fat Fiction, which I highly recommend, that we're both in.
Yes.
I think it's really important that you kind of see, how does your body respond? So when we follow insulin levels, we follow cholesterol, and we see how it changes, people are very thrilled with that, and I'm thrilled with it as a physician, because I go, I know you're getting metabolically healthy. Don't worry about that. You only lost 2. I have a guy who lost 2 pounds since July, lost 2 pounds, lost 10 inches off his waist, put 3 inches on his biceps. You know, his chest has come down 4 inches, and he's put on muscle mass, and he's wearing pants when he was 40 pounds lighter. It's like,
Wow.
your friends weigh in with you, or do they look at you, right? Because everyone's seeing it. They go, how much weight have you lost? He said 2 pounds, but he's put a ton of muscle mass on. He's changed his whole lifestyle, right?
Yeah.
But I think things like that, when you see it, you go, wow, that's really cool. So Troy, you got questions for us?
Yeah, we got a ton of questions here. This one's a good one, and it's basically from Greg here. He says, I've seen a lot of different types of fish oil, salmon, wild blend, etc. And we know there's a lot of studies that have actually looked at how much fish oil is oxidized, you know, out there before you even get it when it comes to supplements. In my practice, I tell people, just eat the fish skin. I know you may not like to hear this. Maybe we disagree. Eat the fish skin. Forget about the fish oil. But what do you say about which fish oil to get, and how do you know that it's real, and how do you know that it's not oxidized?
This is a great question, but it's not really just about fish oil. I get this all the time about supplements. I hear one of the saddest things to me as a nutritionist, knowing what things like magnesium and fish oil can do when they're taken in the proper dosage and the proper form. I will run into someone and they'll say, I tried that fish oil, didn't do anything. And I say, really, what did you take? I don't know. I got it at the, and they'll mention a big box store. And what was the dose? Oh, I don't know. And it's heartbreaking to me. And I did a video on this, and I asked people, just go to YouTube and look at my video on how to buy vitamins. The answer is, with all of this, that you have got to buy the highest quality that's available. And I worked in my early career, I worked with a doctor in New York City who had an integrative doctor, who had a sign in his office saying there are 3 things you should not look for bargains in: parachutes, tattoos, and vitamin supplements. The difference between an expensive and highly, curated fish oil that comes from a lab where they do assays and they make it in small, an artisan fish oil, if you will. The difference between that and the crap that, may come from China or from the fish was in the bottom of the Hudson River. I mean, you have to look at origins, and the difference in price between the cheapest junk and the most expensive supplement is kind of small when you compare the difference between a crappy car and the highest priced car, or a small house and a big house. It's not that much, and you really shouldn't shop for bargains in them. People say, I burp up the fish oil. That's all bad fish oil. So if you get, and I'm not pushing any brand, I'm just saying, get what we call doctor brands, which are, I'm sure they're the ones that you guys, well, I don't know, Brian, you're not big into supplements, but there's a whole bunch of brands that really come out of doctors' offices. They're very carefully curated. There's ways to buy those brands. Just get that stuff and give that a try. It's not just fish oil. It's how much EPA was in it, and how much DHA it was in it, how purified was it, and what's the dose of it. So you really can't, all fish oil is not created equal. All magnesium supplements aren't created equal. There's magnesium oxide, the cheapest and least absorbable. There's magnesium glycinate, magnesium carbonate, magnesium citrate. So they're not all equal. And I really wish that people would understand the importance of getting really high quality supplements. Maybe they won't work for you, but give them a try. You're not giving them a try if you buy the cheap stuff.
And I think the important caveat is, I think the studies that showed no benefit from omega-3s were on a really, really terrible processed food diet, rather than eating a real food diet like
Also low dose,
using it as a supplement. Yeah.
If you look at it, it was a low dose.
And a low dose also, yeah.
If you look at the studies for Vasipa, which have literally been shown to decrease plaques in studies now, in outcome studies, and decrease, which is very potent, high dose essential fish oil, there seems to be a very clear benefit. So, I think probably you're right. It's certainly, you got to fix the diet, but I think a dose and quality issue is there. You got some more questions. Maybe we got time for one more.
Sure.
We have time for one more question. Okay. Here we go. Why, when I introduce exercise, my PCP says my LDL goes up? How can I prevent this? I won't take a statin.
Oh, I'll leave that to you guys.
Here's the deal with that. I'm telling you, this is what's funny, and Tro will probably back me on this. I see it all the time. If you exercise more, a lot, and you're a low carb
Depends
person.
on the exercise, though, right?
And it depends on the exercise too. But if you're exercising more, what you're doing is burning off some of the triglycerides. As you lower your triglycerides, your LDL goes up. Or if you're losing weight, guess what? Your LDL goes up because you're kicking more fat into your system. So you're seeing it in the blood. Doesn't mean that you're, this whole energy model with Dave Feldman, it's a huge deal to understand that. Because if I fast for 3 days, my LDL goes up. Does that mean fasting is going to kill me? No, it doesn't. It just means I'm seeing more energy in the system. So I've had people drop their LDL. A good friend of mine, Jeff Cotterman, he gave me permission to talk about this stuff. He's an athletic guy, and he switched from carb loading everyone to low carb. And anyways, he goes, my LDL went up. What should I do? I'm getting life insurance. Eat sugar over the week. Eat carbs. Not sugar, but carbs over the weekend. Add some baked potato, things like that. He drops his LDL 60 points. Does that mean he's healthier? No, it just means he passed the test. So I think there's stuff like that when you say, hey, when you change your diet, you can alter your LDL significantly with exercise. It doesn't mean you're getting sicker. It just means that's what we're seeing in the bloodstream, that it's transporting energy from one place to another. So that's one thing I've noticed is just a couple of days of dietary change can make a huge difference in LDL levels. And Tro, do you have any
Yeah, no, I mean,
counter on that?
Bottom line, we've seen a very clear signal that if you're lean weight and low carb and you do a lot of cardio, your LDL will go up. If you do resistance training, it seems to normalize or sometimes decrease. But when you're asking your body to burn fat for fuel and then not giving it carbohydrates, right? You're again asking your body to burn fat for fuel, then it's going to mobilize whatever is moving that fat around, which is, basically cholesterol. So we typically see it go up. Absolutely. You can do cardio. We say get the best bang for your buck and do some high intensity interval training, and it probably won't go up as much. But
sugars also I've seen that in people where they're doing high intensity weight training for 15 minutes and their sugars stay the flat or they drop a little bit. So there's a lot of that. I've seen people doing really intense exercise and they're very thin and their LDL goes crazy high, like scary high. And their sugars go crazy high too, because they're sending a panic message to their body. They switch over to a Dr. Ben type workout, liberalize their carbs a little bit, and everything normalizes. It is really incredible because your body panics. Like, where am I going to pull energy from at some point? Like, if your glycogen stores are depleted in your liver, you don't have much of a backup. So it has to kick fat out for you to run on. So it doesn't want you to run out of energy. So your body's trying to help you out. So maybe you have to help your body a little bit and not work out, 7 days a week, 5 hours a day. And you're going to see a difference in that. So for a lot of people, it's just numbers. It's really like, it's like Johnny's saying, it's like, okay, I don't care what your numbers are. If you're not having a heart attack, if you're metabolically healthier, the numbers don't scare me as much because we see what's happening. So be with a doctor who can look at the numbers and understand it, and get a good cardiologist who understands risk factors, right? Not just numbers. It's not just a stamp. That's what we become as doctors. Stamp. LDL over 130, this is dangerous, statin drug, right? That's a stamp that everyone has.
And let's remember that we're still talking about LDL in the old-fashioned way, like it's one thing. My LDL went up. Remember, the whole purpose of this book is to say LDL's got a million different types. There's a study, I'll never forget it, Dreon, D-R-E-O-N. It was also American Journal of Clinical Nutrition. She looked at this where she said the LDL went up with some kind of thing that they were doing, but then they looked under the hood and they said, wait a minute, it went up, but it's mostly all those fluffy particles that don't do any damage. And the LDL-B, which is atherogenic, went down. So even though your LDL went up, you were way more metabolically healthy. And that's the information we're not looking at. Second thing I want to say about that is, even if you take the old model of LDL, stress can raise LDL. Steve Sinatra tells a personal story in the book. He was in residency. He hadn't eaten all day. He's got to go into surgery at 6 o'clock. On the way up, just for fun, he does a blood test. His cholesterol's through the roof. He doesn't have high cholesterol, high LDL. He hadn't eaten all day. Nothing had changed his LDL except the stress, and it went down the next day. So number one, all kinds of things can influence LDL temporarily up or down. And number two, it doesn't matter. You need to know what kind of LDL is changing. And sometimes LDL as a category goes up, but in fact, under the hood, the harmless stuff is going up and the bad stuff is going down. And that, I think, is a take-home message. Would you agree?
Absolutely. Stress will make sugars go crazy. I've seen stuff where I'm like, oh my gosh, what did you eat? He's like, I was fasting. And I had a stressful test. Triglycerides can get messed up, and there's a lot of that people just don't look at it. How about with regard to ApoB? Are we seeing change? I don't follow it generally. Are we seeing significant changes on a low carb ketogenic diet and lifestyle?
Yeah, the data is pretty much flat. It depends. It's just like LDL. It pretty much tracks with LDL in terms of the data. In terms of the data, Verda's data basically showed it stayed flat. Hello.
All right. Yeah, I didn't know if you had another. I'm waiting for you to ask another question, Tro.
Oh no, I think that's it for now. We do have some more questions, but we're coming on an hour and a half, so I think this is just awesome. This has been amazing.
Yeah,
I
Johnny,
can't wait
thank
to read
you
the
so
book.
much.
You really like Brian
guys.
Moore. You must have got
connections,
him a
man.
copy, man. You got to mail that to me.
Hey, man, we've been in movies together, so we kind of have a little connection.
Yeah, we have
But no, I was excited.
Absolutely,
Yeah, when I saw you, I was on the movie. I was like, we have to have this guy on the podcast. Why we had him on?
Thank you, man.
And it's really important because you know your stuff and you reach people. And man, having you as a trainer, or helping with at life coaching, I think that's a huge thing. And I think, so many of us have missed out on this huge aspect of what you talk about in the book of lifestyle and stress levels. And not having a dog. We see studies. You go, that's dumb. Having a dog, yeah, it makes a difference, right? Having companionship, and this all ties back to what we're going through right now as a society. And that's what I've been seeing. I think, man, if you're tense and you hate your neighbor because the sign they have in front of their yard or whatever, what religion they are, or who they love, that's going to affect your health, not in a negative way, right? And so being able to love people and accept them, like, okay, cool, I like the way you do it, let me learn from you, maybe I'll learn something, maybe I don't need to fight with you. And I think that's a big take-home message, is this lifestyle and doing stuff you're passionate and that you enjoy. You clearly love what you're doing, you love people, right? And you're out doing fun stuff and enjoying life. I think that's a lot of people forget about that. And I'm telling you, as a doctor, that's really stressful for me when I see, a lady just yesterday, I go, what do you do for fun? She said, eat chocolate.
Boy.
That's what I do for fun, because that gives me peace. Everything else, bad marriage, stressful life, and you look at it, it's like, wow, that is your only outlet. Like, we got to figure that one out. That's a huge
Yes, I got to underline that is so important. When people say what I do for happiness or life is I smoke pot or I eat chocolate or whatever, you can't just, that's terrible. You got to go, then that's their only access to pleasure. That's what we got to look at. Don't start by telling them don't eat the chocolate. Let's see where other places in your life you could find joy, so that you don't have to depend on that. And I tell you this as a personal story, we could end on if you want. Next month, I have a birthday. I'm going to be 74. I know what it feels like to be 74 in this level of health and energy and optimism and enthusiasm and engagement with life. I want that for everybody. It is possible. And if you follow this crappy diet stuff, it ain't going to happen. Now, I didn't start till I was 38. I was a drug addict. I think you know that. We talked about that, and alcohol and drug. And I didn't do any of this till 38. There is time to turn this around, but it really does start with food and with a more expansive idea of your contribution to life. It starts with food, though.
Absolutely.
Wow. All right, man. Johnny, you're coming on my other podcast. We're gonna make it happen.
I'd love to.
And when you get a break, because I think that's such an important topic, But everyone, thank you for listening. Patreon supporters, we really appreciate you for keeping us going, because this is really important information for people to hear. And Johnny's getting his book out there, and this is something he just did. He's been working on this for years and years and years, and life experience and training people and, making observations. So I think that's really important. Really look, physicians and healthcare providers, look at your patients and see what's happening. If they're all healthy and great, keep doing what you're doing. If they're not, you gotta reassess. Like we all had to reassess.
Amen.
Guys, thank you so much for having me on. It's been a privilege.